Sometimes, I think about the first time I met Henry, and how naive I was, how easily the world seemed to bend around our dreams. It was a chilly spring morning in Lyon, the kind of day where the cobblestones glistened after rain and the scent of fresh croissants drifted from the boulangeries. I had been sitting alone in that small café near Place Bellecour, scribbling in a notebook I insisted on carrying everywhere. I was 22, full of stubborn ideas and reckless hope, imagining a life that would take me far from the small worries of everyday existence. Henry walked in like a sunbeam cutting through gray clouds. He had a crooked smile and a laugh that made people lean in without realizing it. I remember he spilled coffee on his sleeve the first day we met, and instead of panicking, he smiled, shrugged, and asked if he could borrow a napkin. I laughed so hard I nearly choked, and in that moment, I felt like fate itself had reached down and tapped me on the shoulder. We talked for hours that day, about dreams, about travel, about the little absurdities of life that made everything feel fragile and beautiful at the same time. He told me he wanted a vineyard someday, that he wanted children, that he believed in love so completely it scared me. I laughed at the idea. I was terrified of being so vulnerable, but I also wanted it, desperately. And then we fell in love, slowly, naturally, without fanfare or fireworks. He moved in after 3 months, and within a year, we were married in a tiny chapel, surrounded by the smell of lilacs and the laughter of our closest friends. The early years were, in retrospect, deceptively easy. Henry worked as an accountant, meticulous and careful. I worked odd jobs, waitressing, teaching piano, writing articles no one ever published. Money was tight, of course, but we laughed about it. We shared everything, down to the last euro. There were arguments, certainly, but they were fleeting, trivial, and usually resolved with a shared bottle of wine and a long walk along the rain. Then Lee came. I remember the first time I held her, her tiny body trembling with life, and I cried in a way I hadn't known I could. She was fiery, insistent, and brilliant even as a newborn. Her cries sounded like music. Her eyes were mine, but also Henry's. She was our spark, our reason to endure. Julian followed 2 years later, quieter and more observant. He never cried as loudly, never demanded attention with the same intensity. He watched, catalogued, learned, and yet loved fiercely in the ways he knew how. Raising them was both exhausting and joyous. Every scraped knee, every midnight fever, every triumphant first day at school. These moments became the threads weaving our family together. But life has a way of eroding even the strongest bonds, in quiet, insidious ways. Henry's relationship with money had always been a delicate topic. Early on, I had asked him to show me bank statements or even just discuss our finances openly. He would brush me off with a laugh. "Don't worry, your pretty little head, Claire," he said, and I had smiled back, believing him. I wanted to trust him. I needed to. Yet, over the years, I began noticing little things. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with vague excuses about meetings or errands. Sometimes I would find receipts in drawers that didn't make sense, bank notifications he didn't mention. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the assumption that I wouldn't notice, that I wasn't capable of understanding the world of numbers he so carefully navigated. At first, I dismissed it. He's protecting me, I told myself. He wants to shelter me from stress. I would sip my coffee in the mornings, staring at the gray rooftops of our small town, and whisper promises to myself. I would never doubt him. I would never let fear poison my love. Yet deep down, a seed of unease was growing. Small things, the way his jaw tightened when I asked questions, the brief flash of irritation when I mentioned bills or savings, the careful way he would hide letters or phone calls. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was normal. I thought it was part of being married. Those early years weren't all perfect, of course. There were arguments about parenting, about how much time we spent at work versus with the children, about vacations or the lack thereof. I remember one particularly sharp winter evening when Lee was about 4. She had scraped her knee on the playground, and I wanted to take her to the hospital immediately. Henry argued that it was a small cut, that she didn't need to make a fuss. "You're overreacting," he said, voice clipped, pacing the kitchen while I tried to bandage her trembling little body. "And you're underreacting," I snapped, tears pricking my eyes. "She's our daughter, Henry. Can't you see that?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with a mixture of frustration and something colder. Something I didn't yet know how to name. That night, I lay awake, listening to the wind whip against the window panes, feeling the first twinges of doubt about our partnership. I loved him fiercely, but even then, I began noticing a pattern, a quiet eroding of trust, the unspoken assumption that I would accept whatever he dictated. The lottery ticket should have been just another chance, a small whimsy in our long lives together, but it became the magnifying glass revealing the truths I had avoided for decades. Henry had always assumed he could control everything, the money, the household, even me, and when the numbers matched, when 20 million euros suddenly hung between us like a blade, he revealed the depths of his entitlement. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see him pacing in that kitchen, shadows falling across his face as he told me I could leave. I remember thinking, in that surreal moment, that everything we had shared, the love, the laughter, the sacrifices, had been a fragile construct, easily shattered. I had never imagined that the man I married could be so blind, so cold, so quick, to discard a life we had built together. For weeks afterward, I replayed memories in my mind. I traced our history back to that first cafe meeting, to the tiny chapel wedding, to the births of our children. I tried to reconcile the man I had loved with the one who had kicked me out. I remembered small details, his hand brushing mine on a cold morning, the way he smiled at the children, the soft tone of his voice in quiet moments. And yet, no matter how I tried, I could not ignore the truth. Henry's love had always been conditional, always measured, always contingent on my compliance with his vision of the world, and I refused to let that define me anymore. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe. Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. It was in the quiet mornings, alone in Lyon, as I sipped bitter coffee and watched the city wake, that I realized something profound. Betrayal does not diminish your value. It does not erase your past, nor does it determine your future. The love I had given, the life I had lived, it was mine, not his, and now it was time to take it back. The weeks after the lottery win felt like living inside a storm, not the kind that rages outside and then passes, but the kind that swirls quietly inside the house, bending everything to its own chaos. Henry had changed. I didn't see it at first. He smiled, joked, poured wine at dinner, but under the surface, there was a calculation, a quiet obsession that pulsed behind his eyes. Every conversation turned into a test. Every question I asked about the ticket, about the money, was met with impatience or subtle derision. "Claire, don't be ridiculous," he would say, brushing my hands off the table. Or, "You'll see. Let me handle it. It's better this way." And I began to see a paterna, silent assertion of control, a demand for unquestioning trust that I had always given freely, without realizing it was no longer a gift but an expectation. It was subtle at first, little comments like, "You don't need this, I'll take care of it," or, "You always overthink things." But slowly, like cracks forming in stone, the weight of it became undeniable. I started noticing the small ways he manipulated our home, conversations, even the children. He suggested outings and plans he knew I would refuse, then acted hurt when I declined. He dismissed my ideas for the house renovations, for family trips, for how we should invest the money. It was as though my opinions no longer mattered in a life we had built together. One afternoon, Lee, now 16, wandered into the living room while I was sitting with Henry, trying to plan a simple vacation. "Mom, can we go see the exhibition in Lyon next week?" she asked, eyes hopeful. Henry's brow furrowed. "Lee, that's expensive and unnecessary. We have more important things to consider." "But," Papa Lee started, and I felt a flash of protective fury. "Claire," Henry said, turning to me, his tone firm, almost warning, "don't encourage her. She's too young to make decisions about money." I froze. The words were sharper than any knife. Too young to dream, too young to have a voice. I looked at my daughter, at the hope and innocence in her gaze, and then back at Henry, and felt a cold clarity. The man I had married did not see us as partners or family. He saw us as pieces on a board, pieces to control. And then came the nights, those long, suffocating nights where Henry would sit in the study, counting, checking, double-checking accounts, muttering numbers under his breath like a mantra. I would sit at the edge of the doorway, watching, my heart tight with a mixture of fear and anger. One evening, I dared to ask a simple question. "Henry, who are you talking to about this money?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't look at me. "Why do you care? It's none of your business." I felt something break inside me. That was when I realized he had never intended to share this with me, not the money, not the decisions, not the future. He had imagined a life where I was either silent or gone. The days blurred together. I would wake to the sound of Henry's shoes on the tiles, the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, the distant hum of the town. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home. Each morning, I would sit at the table, coffee in hand, watching Henry, counting the minutes until I could escape to the market or the bakery or anywhere else that didn't feel like a cage. It all came to a head one Sunday morning. I had been quietly observing him for hours, pretending not to notice the pile of letters, the phone calls, the hurried whispers. I finally spoke. "Henry, we need to talk about the ticket," I said softly, carefully. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "About what? About the money? About us? About this life you think you can control alone?" I replied. My voice was stronger than I expected, even to me. He laughed, a short, sharp sound, void of warmth. "Claire, do you even understand what you're saying? You think you can manage this? You think you deserve this?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. He stood, pacing now, hands clenched. I realized then that nothing I said mattered, not reason, not truth, not love. He had made his choice. "You can leave," he said finally, flat and definitive. "You can take your things and leave. I'll take care of everything else." The room spun. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too accusing. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just packed a bag, my hands trembling with the shock of betrayal, the loss of the life I thought I had, and the strange, quiet seed of resolve that had begun to grow within me. I wandered through Lyon that day, aimless at first, then seeking something I couldn't name, a sanctuary, a space where I could think without fear, without judgment, without Henry's shadow looming over every thought. The city felt different somehow, sharper, more alive. The cobblestone streets reflected the gray sky, rain beginning to fall in soft sheets. I ducked into a small bakery, bought a warm baguette, and watched through the window as the world moved on without me. It was in that quiet, in that moment of displacement, that I began to understand something profound. Henry had tried to erase me, to discard me like an inconvenient truth, but he had underestimated me, and I was learning, slowly, painfully, that I was stronger than I had believed. I would not vanish. I would not dissolve. I would reclaim my life, piece by piece, day by day, and when the time came, I would confront the truths Henry had tried to hide. That night, as I sat alone in the small apartment I had rented, listening to the rain tap against the window, I allowed myself a small, secret thought. Maybe this was a beginning, not an end. Maybe Henry's betrayal was the key that would unlock something within me I hadn't known existed. I didn't know yet what that would look like, or how I would find it. But deep down, in the quiet of that stormy evening, I made a promise to myself. I would survive, and I would thrive. Lyon felt different when I was alone. It wasn't just the emptiness of the apartment I rented in Rouse, though that weighed heavily enough. It was the absence of Henry's shadow in every corner, in every cupboard, in every corner of my mind. For weeks, I had wandered the city streets like a ghost, seeking something solid, something real, anything that would remind me that I still existed outside of his control. The mornings were my refuge. I would wake before dawn, pull on a threadbare coat, and make my way to the bakery near the Place des Terreaux. The smell of fresh bread greeted me before the first hint of sunlight peeked through the shutters, warm and reassuring. I worked long hours, kneading dough, shaping loaves, my hands coated in flour, my muscles sore but steady. In the rhythm of the work, I found a quiet sense of purpose. The hours were long, yes, but they belonged entirely to me. The owner, Madame Fournier, was a stout, no-nonsense woman with a face carved by years of sun and labor. She didn't pry, she didn't question. She simply nodded at me each morning, sliding a steaming cup of coffee toward my hands. "You'll do fine, Claire. Just don't let anyone tell you otherwise," she said one morning, her voice rough but warm. I realized then that survival was no longer about Henry, it was about me, about remembering who I was before the constant tension, before the feeling of being unmoored in my own home. The bakery became my sanctuary, the early hours my meditation. I discovered a quiet joy in creating something with my hands, in seeing the sun rise over the rain while the city stirred awake. The children visited occasionally, tentative, unsure of their place in this new reality. "Lee, now 16, would sit quietly, her fiery spirit tempered by confusion and loyalty torn between her father and me. Julian, more reserved, watched me carefully, as if measuring every word, every gesture, to see whether I had truly changed or simply survived. One rainy afternoon, Lee spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "Mom, do you think Dad will ever apologize?" I shook my head, forcing a small, sad smile. "I don't know, sweetie, maybe. But apologies don't always fix the damage. What matters is what we do next." Julian nodded, his eyes wide and understanding. "We just need to stick together, right?" "Yes," I said softly, my heart aching. "We stick together." The city itself became a character in my life. I wandered past narrow streets, the sound of water rushing in gutters after rain, the echo of shoes on cobblestones, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor in the square. I would sit in small cafes, notebook in hand, writing letters I never sent, chronicling the betrayal, the loss, the quiet triumphs of simply surviving each day. Evenings were harder. The apartment was small and quiet, and the memories of Henry's betrayal pressed against me like a weight. I would sit by the window, watching the lights of the city blur in the rain, and replay the confrontation in the kitchen, the words, the coldness, the casual cruelty of him telling me to leave. I hated him in those moments, yes, but more than that, I hated the part of me that had allowed myself to be invisible for so long. And yet, even in the quiet despair, there was a subtle thread of curiosity, a spark that I couldn't ignore. Henry had assumed the ticket was his. He had acted on that assumption, expelling me from the life we shared. But there was something that nagged at me, some small, unspoken detail that didn't sit right. Perhaps it was the way he had celebrated, with certainty, as if he didn't need to check, as if the name on the ticket was irrelevant. Perhaps it was the fleeting hesitation I had glimpsed in his eyes that one morning, just before the argument. I didn't know what it meant yet, but deep down, a small, persistent thought grew. Maybe he had made a mistake. In those weeks, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my self-image. I realized I had spent decades bending, adjusting, and muting myself to fit Henry's expectations. Now, I walked differently, held my head higher, and allowed myself to think, to dream, to hope again. I explored the city's galleries and parks, met strangers who were kind, sharp, and alive, and allowed myself small indulgences: chocolate from the patisserie on Rue Merchant, a second coffee on rainy afternoons, the thrill of discovering a tiny, overlooked bookstore tucked behind an alley. Every night, as I wrote in my letters to myself, I felt a sense of quiet determination. Henry's betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also stripped away the illusions that had kept me trapped. For the first time in decades, I understood my own power. And then, one rainy afternoon, the spark ignited. I had stopped at the market to buy fresh flowers, the smell of damp earth and chrysanthemums filling my senses, when I saw him, Henry, with a young woman, holding her hand, laughing in a way that made my chest tighten. The scene should have angered me, and it did, but not in the way I expected. Instead, a thought struck me: the confidence in his laughter, the ease with which he moved as if the world belonged to him, felt off. He hadn't checked the ticket, had he? That small, quiet suspicion settled in my mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. From that moment, a subtle obsession began. I would watch him from a distance, take note of patterns, observe his behavior without him knowing. Not out of pettiness or revenge, at least, not entirely, but out of necessity. I needed to know the truth. That night, as I sat in my apartment, listening to the rain drumming against the window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, a fragile, delicate hope, yes, but hope nonetheless. Henry had underestimated me, as he always had, but this time, I would not be underestimated. I wrapped my shawl tightly around my shoulders, sipped bitter coffee, and whispered to myself, a promise and a warning both. I will find the truth. And when I do, I will reclaim my life. Lion felt different when I was alone. It wasn't just the emptiness of the apartment I rented in Croix, though that weighed heavily enough. It was the absence of Henry's shadow in every corner, in every cupboard, in every corner of my mind. For weeks, I had wandered the city streets like a ghost, seeking something solid, something real, anything that would remind me that I still existed outside of his control. The mornings were my refuge. I would wake before dawn, pull on a threadbare coat, and make my way to the bakery near the Place des Terreaux. The smell of fresh bread greeted me before the first hint of sunlight peeked through the shutters, warm and reassuring. I worked long hours, kneading dough, shaping loaves, my hands coated in flour, my muscles sore but steady. In the rhythm of the work, I found a quiet sense of purpose. The hours were long, yes, but they belonged entirely to me. The owner, Madame Fournier, was a stout, no-nonsense woman with a face carved by years of sun and labor. She didn't pry, she didn't question. She simply nodded at me each morning, sliding a steaming cup of coffee toward my hands. "You'll do fine, Claire. Just don't let anyone tell you otherwise," she said one morning, her voice rough but warm. I realized then that survival was no longer about Henry, it was about me, about remembering who I was before the constant tension, before the feeling of being unmoored in my own home. The bakery became my sanctuary, the early hours my meditation. I discovered a quiet joy in creating something with my hands, in seeing the sun rise over the rain while the city stirred awake. The children visited occasionally, tentative, unsure of their place in this new reality. Lee, now 16, would sit quietly, her fiery spirit tempered by confusion and loyalty torn between her father and me. Julian, more reserved, watched me carefully, as if measuring every word, every gesture, to see whether I had truly changed or simply survived. One rainy afternoon, Lee spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "Mom, do you think Dad will ever apologize?" I shook my head, forcing a small, sad smile. "I don't know, sweetie, maybe. But apologies don't always fix the damage. What matters is what we do next." Julian nodded, his eyes wide and understanding. "We just need to stick together, right?" "Yes," I said softly, my heart aching. "We stick together." The city itself became a character in my life. I wandered past narrow streets, the sound of water rushing in gutters after rain, the echo of shoes on cobblestones, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor in the square. I would sit in small cafes, notebook in hand, writing letters I never sent, chronicling the betrayal, the loss, the quiet triumphs of simply surviving each day. Evenings were harder. The apartment was small and quiet, and the memories of Henry's betrayal pressed against me like a weight. I would sit by the window, watching the lights of the city blur in the rain, and replay the confrontation in the kitchen, the words, the coldness, the casual cruelty of him telling me to leave. I hated him in those moments, yes, but more than that, I hated the part of me that had allowed myself to be invisible for so long. And yet, even in the quiet despair, there was a subtle thread of curiosity, a spark that I couldn't ignore. Henry had assumed the ticket was his. He had acted on that assumption, expelling me from the life we shared. But there was something that nagged at me, some small, unspoken detail that didn't sit right. Perhaps it was the way he had celebrated, with certainty, as if he didn't need to check, as if the name on the ticket was irrelevant. Perhaps it was the fleeting hesitation I had glimpsed in his eyes that one morning, just before the argument. I didn't know what it meant yet, but deep down, a small, persistent thought grew. Maybe he had made a mistake. In those weeks, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my self-image. I realized I had spent decades bending, adjusting, and muting myself to fit Henry's expectations. Now, I walked differently, held my head higher, and allowed myself to think, to dream, to hope again. I explored the city's galleries and parks, met strangers who were kind, sharp, and alive, and allowed myself small indulgences: chocolate from the patisserie on Rue Merchant, a second coffee on rainy afternoons, the thrill of discovering a tiny, overlooked bookstore tucked behind an alley. Every night, as I wrote in my letters to myself, I felt a sense of quiet determination. Henry's betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also stripped away the illusions that had kept me trapped. For the first time in decades, I understood my own power. And then, one rainy afternoon, the spark ignited. I had stopped at the market to buy fresh flowers, the smell of damp earth and chrysanthemums filling my senses, when I saw him, Henry, with a young woman, holding her hand, laughing in a way that made my chest tighten. The scene should have angered me, and it did, but not in the way I expected. Instead, a thought struck me: the confidence in his laughter, the ease with which he moved as if the world belonged to him, felt off. He hadn't checked the ticket, had he? That small, quiet suspicion settled in my mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. From that moment, a subtle obsession began. I would watch him from a distance, Take note of patterns, observe his behavior without him knowing. Not out of pettiness, or revenge at least, not entirely but out of necessity. I needed to know the truth. That night, as I sat in my apartment, listening to the rain drumming against the window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, a fragile, delicate hope, yes, but hope nonetheless. Henry had underestimated me, as he always had, but this time, I would not be underestimated. I wrapped my shawl tightly around my shoulders, sipped bitter coffee, and whispered to myself, a promise and a warning both. I will find the truth. And when I do, I will reclaim my life. The first time I saw Henry after leaving Lyon, I almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't the man pacing in our sunlit kitchen, the man who had kicked me out without a second thought. No, this Henry seemed lighter somehow, freer at least. He believed he was. He moved through the streets of Lyon as if he owned the city, laughing easily with a young woman who clung to his arm. Her hair was chestnut brown, bright against the dullness of the rainy afternoon, and the way they moved together made my stomach churn, not with jealousy, exactly, but with an unnameable tension. I ducked behind a column, blending with the shadowed archways, my heart hammering in my chest. Rain pattered against the cobblestones, and the smells of wet stone, roasted chestnuts, and distant coffee filled the air. I wanted to look away, to disappear, to convince myself it didn't matter, but something about the ease in his laugh, the certainty in his movements, pricked at my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. It was then, sitting there in the dim light of the covered passage, that the first glimmer of truth began to form. Henry had assumed the ticket was his. He hadn't checked the name. He didn't need to. And in his arrogance, in his certainty, he had left the door open for me. I began to watch him more carefully, not obsessively, not yet, but with a growing sense of purpose. I observed patterns: the cafe he frequented on Rue Saint-Jean, the small jewelry shop he visited without apparent reason, the young woman who was always just a step behind him, smiling like she owned a secret. And each observation made me feel a mixture of anger, curiosity, and the faint thrill of control I hadn't felt since before the betrayal. One evening, as the city lights reflected off the wet rooftops, I sat in a small cafe across from the square. I pretended to write in my notebook, but my eyes were fixed on Henry as he passed below, laughing, confident, unaware that I existed. I noticed the ticket sticking out slightly from the corner of his wallet as he paid for the cafe's pastries. My pulse quickened. It was almost careless the way he carried it, as if it were already his. But I knew, deep down, that he had made an assumption, and assumptions can be dangerous. I thought about that rainy day, weeks ago, when he had first kicked me out. His voice had been low, deliberate, commanding. "You can leave," he had said, as if my entire existence depended on his approval. And yet, in that very moment, he had unknowingly given me something more powerful than money. He had given me space. Space to breathe, to observe, to prepare. I started to plan cautiously, quietly. Not revenge, not yet, but preparation. I revisited the cafe where we had first met, tracing the streets we had walked hand in hand, imagining what it would be like to reclaim not just the lottery ticket, but my own sense of self. The city itself seemed to conspire with me. The winding streets, the narrow alleys, the hidden courtyards offered refuge and perspective, a way to watch without being seen, a way to think without interruption. Lee and Julian continued to visit, cautious and uncertain. They noticed the tension in my eyes, the way my hands would sometimes shake when I spoke of Henry. I didn't explain the half-truth of my suspicions. I simply told them we were going to be careful, that we needed to wait, to observe, to understand before acting. And they nodded, sensing both the danger and the hope in my words. It was on a particularly gray afternoon, standing beneath the shadowed arches near the St. Jean Cathedral, that I realized just how careless Henry had been. He had carried the ticket assuming it was already his prize, treating it like a formality rather than a reality. He hadn't double-checked the name. He hadn't verified the details. He hadn't realized that in the quiet, unnoticed corners of his arrogance, he had left a door open. My hands trembled slightly as I clenched my coat around me. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice, about reclaiming what had been taken through ignorance and entitlement. And suddenly, a plan began to form, not just in my mind, but in my soul. That evening, I wandered through the narrow streets of Lyon, rain slicking the cobblestones, lanterns flickering in the mist. I thought about all the years of quiet, compromise, the years I had bent and softened, muted my voice, swallowed my frustrations. Henry had assumed I would vanish quietly, as I always had, but I had learned, in the small hours of loneliness and labor, that I was stronger than I had believed. I paused on a bridge overlooking the Seine, watching the water churn and sparkle under the muted city lights. The rain fell steadily, washing the tension from the streets and cleansing my thoughts. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a smile. Henry had underestimated me. He had assumed the ticket, assumed the money, assumed control. But assumptions are fragile. And now, I had the clarity to see it. And yet, there was still fear. Not of Henry. Exactly, he was predictable, bounded by his own arrogance, but of the unknown. What would happen if I acted? What if he realized? What if the young woman noticed? What if my assumptions were wrong? I shook my head, trying to quiet the swirl of questions in my mind. I didn't need certainty. I needed observation, patience, and courage. And I had all three. That night, I wrote in my notebook, he thought he had won. He thought he had the power, but he forgot one thing: he underestimated me. And for the first time since the betrayal, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation, not just for revenge, not just for money, but for life itself. The kind of life where I was no longer invisible, no longer muted, no longer living in the shadows of someone else's assumptions. In the weeks that followed, I watched quietly, noted patterns, and began to plan, not for chaos, not for spectacle, but for justice, and for myself. Henry's arrogance had given me a window, and I intended to walk through it. There would be a reckoning. Of that, I was certain. The first real clue came on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. I had been following my instincts, watching Henry with careful precision, noting patterns, and quietly questioning every move he made. I had returned to the bakery after a long morning, wandering the city, savoring the rhythm of work, the smell of yeast, the hum of the ovens. Madame Fournier had given me a quiet nod, and I had returned it with a small, secret smile. I thought about Henry, constantly, his arrogance, his assumption, the faint spark of hesitation in his eyes the day he kicked me out. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but now, in hindsight, it was glaring. He hadn't checked the name, he hadn't verified the ticket, and somewhere in the midst of his self-satisfied certainty, he had left a mistake, one I was beginning to understand. That afternoon, I spotted him through the bakery window, exiting the nearby cafe with the young woman. His wallet protruded slightly from his coat pocket, a small edge catching the light. I didn't move immediately. I simply watched, noting the slouch of his shoulders, the casual ease, the laughter that seemed almost to rehearse. Something inside me clicked. I had to know, not just because of the money, but because I deserved the truth. I deserved clarity. After decades of manipulation, after betrayal, after quiet compromise, I waited until they disappeared around the corner, and then followed discreetly, ducking behind lampposts, blending with the small clusters of tourists and locals. The rain had begun again, light and steady, washing the streets and making my steps almost silent. That Henry went into a small lottery office, tucked between two narrow buildings. My heart raced. I stayed outside, pretending to tie my shoe, while I watched him hand over a folded piece of paper, the ticket. He spoke briefly with the clerk, laughing, confident, as if victory was already assured. But as the clerk leaned forward, scrutinizing the ticket, Henry's expression shifted ever so slightly. Just a flicker, gone almost instantly, but enough for me to catch it. He hadn't checked the name. I didn't rush inside. I didn't confront him. Instead, I retreated to a nearby cafe, heart hammering, and ordered a cup of black coffee. I watched from the window as Henry left, the young woman, smiling beside him, still oblivious to the truth. I traced the sequence over and over in my mind, piecing together the simple yet monumental error. The ticket had my name on it. All along, it had been mine. The money wasn't his. He had assumed it, acted on assumption, and in doing so, had left the door open. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Shock, disbelief, anger, and elation mingling into a storm of emotion that I had to steady before I lost control. For years, Henry had held power over me through control and assumptions, and now, that power was shifting. I returned to my apartment that evening, drenched and exhilarated. I paced the small living room, thinking through every detail. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Every betrayal, every cold glance, every dismissive remark from Henry over the years, it had all been magnified by his ignorance of this crucial fact. He had believed the ticket was his, and that belief had blinded him to everything else, including the possibility that I would claim what was rightfully mine. I opened my notebook and wrote in large, deliberate letters, "He assumed, I know, I will reclaim what is mine." The next few days were a careful study of Henry's movements. I didn't want confrontation yet. I wanted strategy, timing, certainty. I observed him from cafes, from the park, from corners of streets where he would never suspect me. Every detail mattered. Which days he went to the lottery office, which cafes he visited, how the young woman moved beside him, what times he checked his phone. It was methodical, precise, and exhausting but empowering. I had always been underestimated, always muted, always secondary. But not anymore. Then came the day I finally acted, though indirectly. I walked into the lottery office myself, calm and collected, as though I belonged there every day. I requested information, public information, nothing illegal about the ticket. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, didn't ask questions, only processed the request. And there it was, the confirmation I had dared to hope for. The ticket, legally registered, bore my full name, my signature, my claim. I felt tears rise in my eyes, not from joy, not from vengeance, but from the immense relief of truth. Henry's assumption had been his undoing. His arrogance had left a door open, and I was finally stepping through it. That evening, I sat in the apartment, writing in my notebook, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I thought about Henry, about his smugness, his confidence, the way he had dismissed me, the way he had thought he could control everything. And I smiled, faint but deliberate, that it wasn't anger that consumed me now. It was clarity. And as I sipped a second cup of bitter coffee, I wrote, "He assumed the ticket was his. He never checked the name. Now, everything changes." Lee and Julian visited that night. They noticed a difference in me, an energy, a focus, a quiet certainty. I didn't share all the details, not yet, but I told them enough to instill confidence. "We have a plan, the truth is on our side, and soon, we'll reclaim what is rightfully ours." Lee's eyes sparkled, cautious but hopeful. Julian, more reserved, nodded. We shared a quiet moment of solidarity, the kind that only comes from surviving betrayal together and knowing that the tide is finally turning. That night, as the rain fell softly against the window, I allowed myself a private thought, a secret thrill. Henry had underestimated me. He had assumed power, assumed victory, assumed that I would vanish quietly into the shadows. But assumptions are fragile. They crumble under scrutiny, under patience, under resolve. And now, for the first time in decades, I felt entirely, unmistakably, in control. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe. Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. I sat back, sipping my coffee, staring out at the softly lit streets of Lyon, and whispered to the city itself, "I'm coming back. And when I do, nothing will ever be the same." The day I decided to confront Henry, the air in Lyon was thick and gray, heavy with the threat of rain. I had spent weeks preparing, not just mentally, but emotionally, strategizing every word, every gesture, every step. My apartment had become a command center of observation, planning, and reflection. I knew his routines, his moods, even the subtle twitch of his jaw when he was cornered. I took the tram into view, Lyon, the rhythm of the wheels on tracks beneath my feet strangely calming. Each stop, each turn, reminded me of the distance I had traveled, not geographically, but emotionally. I wasn't the same woman who had left our home in shock and betrayal. I wasn't the one who had trembled at his dismissal, who had softened her words to protect a fragile peace. I had grown, and now, armed with knowledge and resolve, I would reclaim what was mine. I found him at the small cafe near the place, St. John, the young woman at his side, laughter spilling into the quiet street. Henry looked exactly the same, confident, arrogant, convinced of his ownership, but I could see the cracks if I looked closely. The way he fidgeted with his wallet, the brief hesitation in his gaze when he counted the cash from a small lottery office envelope. I approached slowly, deliberately, as if walking into a scene I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind. "Henry," I said, calm and steady. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by his usual smug smile. "Claire, I didn't expect to see you here." I ignored the young woman, whose expression had shifted from amusement to confusion. "We need to talk," I said. My voice held no tremor, No doubt only the quiet authority I had been cultivating for months. Henry leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, a gesture that had once comforted me but now felt almost laughable in its attempt to assert dominance. About what? Money, the children. You're still upset about the ticket, I assume. I smiled faintly, letting the tension settle between us. About the ticket, I said, and about the assumptions you made, the ones that cost you and could have cost you everything. His expression shifted ever so slightly, the slightest twitch around the corner of his mouth. He didn't understand yet. He couldn't see it. I don't follow, he said, trying to keep his tone casual. To mask the first faint shadow of unease, I reached into my bag, pulling out the small envelope I had obtained legally from the lottery office. I placed it on the table, careful to catch the light so he could see it. Your arrogance made a critical mistake, I said softly. You assumed the ticket was yours. You never checked the name. You never verified anything. And yet here it is. Henry's hand twitched, a subtle tremor that betrayed his composure. He leaned forward, peering at the envelope, his confident smile faltering. I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the slow, sinking awareness of what he had overlooked. Claire, his voice cracked, disbelief mingling with anger. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of my emotions settle. This is the result of years of being underestimated, I said. Years of being told to step aside, of being silenced, of being dismissed. But assumptions are fragile, Henry, and I've learned how to notice them, how to wait, and how to act when the time is right. The young woman shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, sensing that she had been an accessory to a game she didn't understand. Henry looked at her, then back at me, his arrogance dissolving into a mix of shock and fear. I continued, my voice steady and calm, though my chest ached with years of suppressed emotion. You thought you could control everything, our house, our money, even my life. But you forgot one thing. You forgot me. You forgot that I could see, I could plan, I could act. And now, Henry, you're too late. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for a response that wouldn't come. For the first time, I saw him as he really was, a man defined by assumptions, by arrogance, by blind certainty. And he had lost. I glanced at the envelope, then back at him. This is mine, I said simply. The ticket, the money, everything you thought you had control over. You made a mistake. I am the one who holds the truth, and you will have to face the consequences of your assumptions. The silence stretched, the young woman moving away slightly, unsure of what to do. Henry's shoulders slumped, the confident posture I had once loved, now broken, brittle. I could see his mind racing, attempting to grasp the enormity of his error. And yet he had no leverage, no words, no plan to reclaim what he had so carelessly assumed. I felt a rush of emotions: vindication, relief, sorrow, and even a strange tenderness for the man I had once loved. Henry, I said softly, this isn't just about the money. It's about respect. It's about trust. It's about realizing that assumptions, arrogance, and control cannot define another person's life. I am done being invisible. He looked at me then, truly looked, and I could see the faintest trace of regret, or perhaps fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, unable to form words that could undo what had been done. I stood, collected the envelope, and turned toward the door, the rain outside casting streaks of light through the cafe window. Lee and Julian were waiting quietly across the street, their presence a grounding reminder of why I had endured, why I had persisted, why I had reclaimed my power. I stepped into the rain, the cold water soaking through my coat, and felt, for the first time in decades, entirely free. Henry did not follow. He could not. His assumptions had failed him. His arrogance had blinded him. And I had emerged from the shadows of betrayal, stronger than ever. The city seemed to embrace me as I walked, the cobblestones glistening, the street lamps casting soft halos of light, the quiet hum of life continuing around me. I turned once, looking back at the cafe, at the man who had tried to erase me, and whispered a final thought. I am no longer invisible, and I will never be taken for granted again. That night, as I sat in my apartment, the envelope safely in my possession, I reflected on the long, winding road that had brought me here. Betrayal had carved deep wounds, but it had also forged resilience. Pain had given way to clarity. And assumptions, no matter how confident, could never withstand truth and determination. If you're still here, Please don't forget to subscribe Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. The rain fell gently against the window, a quiet applause for the life I had reclaimed, for the truth I had uncovered, and for the strength that had been buried inside me all along. I had survived betrayal, outwitted arrogance, and reclaimed not just money, but dignity, power, and self-respect. And in that quiet, rainy evening, I finally understood the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, life gives you a second chance, through luck, but through the clarity of seeing the truth, trusting yourself, and acting when the time is right. End of part 7. The confrontation occurs. Henry's assumptions crumble, Claire reclaims her power, and suspense reaches its emotional climax. The days after the confrontation with Henry were a strange blend of relief, exhaustion, and newfound clarity. Lyon seemed softer somehow, less oppressive. The rain still fell occasionally, washing the streets and rooftops, but it no longer felt heavy, it felt cleansing. Symbolic of the weight I had carried for decades, finally being lifted. Lee and Julian stayed close, sensing that life had shifted, that the quiet tension that had always lingered between us was dissolving. They watched me in those first days, cautious, uncertain, but increasingly aware that I had reclaimed not just the lottery ticket, but something far more significant: myself. I spent mornings in the bakery, hands still coated in flour, kneading bread with a sense of purpose I had never known. Each loaf, each pastry, felt like a small affirmation of life, a reminder that even in the aftermath of betrayal, there was creation, warmth, and continuity. Madame Fournier noticed the change in me, her eyes softening. "You've found yourself, haven't you?" she asked one morning, handing me a steaming cup of coffee. "Yes," I replied, quietly, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I'm finally beginning to buffer." The evenings were the most profound. I would sit with Lee and Julian in our modest apartment, the children sprawled on the couch, a blanket tossed over our legs. We truly talked for the first time in years. Not about money, not about Henry, not about the chaos of the past, but about life, dreams, and the simple things we had once overlooked. Lee spoke of her aspirations: painting, traveling, perhaps studying architecture in Paris. Julian, quieter but equally determined, spoke of starting a small business, learning to invest the way I had always hoped to teach him. And I listened, fully present, fully alive. In those moments, I realized that the lottery ticket, the confrontation, even Henry's betrayal, it had all led to this: a reclamation of our family, a quiet, powerful return to connection and trust. I also allowed myself to reflect deeply on Henry, not out of lingering anger, but out of understanding. He had been shaped by his own fears and arrogance, blind to the truth that others could also act with intelligence, determination, and moral clarity. I had loved him once, and in loving him, I had learned about resilience, boundaries, and self-worth. The pain of betrayal was real, but it was not my cage anymore. I walked the streets of Lyon in the early mornings, coffee in hand, observing the city awaken. The cobblestones glistened with rain, the small shops opened their shutters, and the cafes filled with the murmur of life. Each step felt lighter than the last, a testament to survival, strategy, and the enduring strength of human will. And then, one quiet evening, I made a small journal entry that would come to define this chapter of my life. I survived betrayal. I reclaimed what was mine. But more than that, I reclaimed myself. Money, power, assumptions, they are transient. What lasts is clarity, courage, and the ability to see the truth within oneself. Henry underestimated me, but I will never underestimate myself again. Over time, we began to plan for the future, not in haste, not with the thrill of revenge, but with deliberate, careful intention. Lee enrolled in a small art program in Lyon, one that allowed her to explore her talent without constraints. Julian and I spent weekends discussing investments, creating a small but secure foundation for the years ahead. And I, finally, allowed myself to dream beyond mere survival. The apartment became a home in the fullest sense. Warmth returned, not the warmth of money or control, but the warmth of connection. Shared meals, laughter, and mutual respect. The children were thriving, and I was finally living for myself, not for the approval or fear of someone else. One afternoon, I walked past a quiet, narrow street where Henry had once taken me for a simple, happy coffee date before life's bitterness had crept in. I paused, watching the sunlight fall on the shutters, feeling a surge of gratitude. That man, That betrayal had forced me into a reckoning I might otherwise have avoided. And in that reckoning, I had discovered strength I didn't know I possessed. It was then that I fully understood life doesn't just hand you second chances, you earn them through observation, patience, and courage. I had survived betrayal, outmaneuvered arrogance, and reclaimed not just money, but dignity, power, and self-respect. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe. Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart. In the quiet of the evening, as the city lights reflected off the wet cobblestones, I allowed myself a final reflection. The past cannot be erased, and pain cannot be avoided, but one can survive it, learn from it, and use it as a bridge to something greater. Betrayal had been a storm, yes, but it had also been a teacher, and now, for the first time in decades, I was free to love, to nurture, to build, and most importantly, to live fully and without fear. The streets of Lyons stretched before me, open and unbroken, just like the path I had carved for myself, and I walked it with steady steps, certain of my strength, my worth, and the unwavering truth I would never be underestimated again. The early morning sun filtered through the shutters, casting long stripes of golden light across the apartment floor. I sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, and watched Lee and Julian move about the space with quiet ease. For the first time in decades, the apartment felt like a home, in the truest sense, not just a place to sleep or hide, but a living, breathing space filled with warmth, laughter, and resilience. I took a deep breath and let my mind wander back through the years of betrayal, manipulation, and heartbreak. Henry's arrogance, his careless assumptions, the crushing weight of his control, it all seemed like a distant storm now, something I had survived and emerged stronger from. And yet, the lessons remained, etched deep into my bones. Shaping the woman I had become, I poured my thoughts into my journal, pen gliding across the pages. Life is full of assumptions. People assume loyalty, love, fear, obedience. They assume control, but assumptions are fragile. They crumble under observation, courage, and truth. I survived because I refused to be defined by someone else's assumptions. I reclaimed my life because I believed in my own clarity, patience, and resolve. The rain began softly outside, pattering against the window like a gentle reminder of the cleansing that had taken place in my life. Each drop mirrored the years I had spent in quiet endurance, each one washing away a piece of doubt, fear, and sorrow. I thought of Henry, not with anger, but with understanding, a man trapped in his own assumptions, blind to the truth that others could also act with intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. Over the following weeks, our family settled into a new rhythm. Leah's paintings began filling our small walls, vibrant colors that reflected her newfound confidence and joy. Julian's small business projects started to take shape, careful planning and his mother's advice guiding every step, and I rediscovered myself, slowly and deliberately, savoring the simple victories of life, the quiet moments of reflection, and the profound beauty of ordinary days. I returned to the bakery more frequently, the smell of yeast and flour grounding me. In reality, in creation, in life itself. Madame Fournier greeted me with a nod, her eyes soft with approval. "You've found your balance, Claire," she said one morning. "You've come back to yourself." "Yes," I replied, a small smile curling my lips. "I finally have." It was in these quiet moments that I realized how much of life is built on small choices, the decision to speak, to leave, to observe, to wait, to act. My confrontation with Henry had been necessary, yes, but it had been the culmination of countless small decisions, choosing self-respect over fear, patience over impulsivity, clarity over confusion. I thought about the lottery ticket, that pivotal object that had sparked the conflict but had ultimately been only a symbol of what truly mattered: awareness, strength, and self-belief. Money, I realized, was transient. Control, assumed or claimed, was fleeting. But clarity, courage, and the ability to stand firm in one's truth, those were enduring. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I walked with Lee and Julianne along the sand. The city was quiet, the lamplights reflecting on the water's surface like scattered stars. I held their hands, feeling the solidity of our connection, the warmth of shared triumph and survival. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Lee said softly, her eyes shining. "You never gave up." I squeezed her hand, fighting back tears. "And neither should you," I whispered. Never let anyone assume your life, your voice, or your worth. You are stronger than you realize, and you always have been. Julian nodded, quiet but resolute. We'll always be together, he said simply, no matter what. Yes, I replied, my heart swelling with a deep, abiding gratitude. Together, we are unshakable. That night, I wrote my final entry in the journal I had kept throughout the ordeal. Betrayal teaches, pain strengthens, and patience reveals the truth. Life is not about avoiding suffering. It is about learning how to move through it, how to act with integrity, and how to reclaim your own voice when others try to take it away. Assumptions can destroy, but clarity, courage, and love endure. I have survived. I have reclaimed my power, and now I live fully. The city outside continued its quiet rhythm, indifferent yet comforting, as I sat in the warmth of our reclaimed home. The memories of betrayal still lingered, like distant shadows, but they no longer held me captive. I had walked through pain, through doubt, through fear, and emerged stronger, wiser, and whole. I looked at Lee and Julian, their faces soft in the lamplight, and smiled. Life was fragile, fleeting, and unpredictable, but it was also beautiful, resilient, and full of possibility, and I would never again let someone else's assumptions define my existence. I closed my journal, the pen still warm in my hand, and whispered a quiet promise. I will live fully, love deeply, and always trust myself. No one can take that from me. The rain had stopped. The streets glimmered with light and hope, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly, utterly free. As I sat there, watching the soft glow of the streetlights reflect on the rain-kissed cobblestones, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had survived betrayal, reclaimed my power, and rebuilt my life on my own terms. Life would always have its challenges, but now I knew that clarity, courage, and self-belief could guide me through anything. If you're still here, please don't forget to subscribe to Myla Stories. I share stories that come straight from the heart, stories of real-life struggles, triumphs, and lessons we can all learn from. I want to hear from you too. What would you have done if you were in Claire's shoes? Would you have confronted Henry, or taken a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives and stories. Remember, life isn't just about surviving the storms, it's about learning from them, trusting yourself, and never letting anyone else's assumptions define your worth.